At 1:30 p.m. on August the 28th of 2003, a pizza delivery driver named Brian Wells would go out on what seemed to be a normal pizza delivery. 1 hour later, he would be standing in a PNC bank with a shotgun in his hand and a bomb strapped to his chest, demanding $250,000. The tragedy and mysteries that began to unfold that day have been described by federal agents as one of the most complicated and bizarre crimes in the annals of the FBI. Hello everybody, today we are going to be talking about FBI Major Case 203, the Bomb Collar Bank Heist. The events of the Bomb Collar Bank Heist are among the most bizarre in criminal history. Those of you that have heard of this case know how absolutely insane it is, and to those of you that haven't, you are in for it today. Now, to try to help us make sense of all of this, I for one have a whiteboard, but also cute little mugshots that I printed out of everyone involved to try to help us wrap our minds around all of this insanity. Now, over the course of this video, I'm going to be referencing journalists and news sites that originally covered this information, as opposed to my arts and crafts project. But the primary one I want to recommend is the Netflix miniseries Evil Genius, made by Barbara Schroeder and Trey Borzillieri, as they not only did a great job covering the events, but also went and interviewed people and got first-hand accounts and information that can be found nowhere else that we're going to talk about today. So if this case interests you, I highly recommend you check out the 4-episode miniseries on Netflix. And today, I'm going to try to go through and tell the story in the timeline that it was revealed to the public and investigators at large. So if you're familiar with this case and you're yelling at the screen at any point if I say something that was proven to be wrong later down the line, I'm laying out information in the order it was discovered, so don't worry, we'll get there. So if you're interested in hearing what turned out to be an overly complicated and cruel bank heist, then stick around as we talk about the Bomb Collar Bank robbery. And it's just going to be really sad and depressing. It'll be funny in some parts, but mostly just sad and depressing. So if you're interested in that, you've come to the right place. But before I talk about something that will definitely be bad for your brain, let's talk about something that will definitely be good for your body. Like today's sponsor, Athletic Greens. And specifically, their fantastic product, the dietary supplement to help you start your day on the right foot, AG1. Y'all like the whiteboard with the logos and stuff on it? I think it's cute. AG1 is a full-body dietary supplement that helps support things like your immune system, digestion, and energy without being 100 different pills that you have to take every morning, and is instead just one drink. AG1 is full of things like probiotics to support your gut health, as well as several ingredients to aid in digestion. But it's also full of things like natural form B12 and biotin to increase your daily energy, and things like zinc and citrate to help support your immune system. AG1 is pretty much what should be your daily dose of vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, and probiotics, all wrapped into one drink. And it's okay, bros, there's no shame in it. As someone who spends all day behind a computer putting together videos, my diet consists primarily of ramen, pizza, and more ramen. But on top of that, I'm also really lazy, which means I don't want to keep track of all the multivitamins and oils and supplements that I'm supposed to take every day. So in other words, I should be dead. But thanks to Athletic Greens, I don't have to micromanage how many pills or drinks I'm taking every morning, because with AG1, it's just one easy step. Your AG1 will come in a bag like this, or you can do what I did and put it in this very aesthetic thermos to help with storage and refrigeration. So all that you have to do for AG1 is get 8 to 12 ounces of cold water, and from there just take a scoop of your AG1, dump it into the water, shake it up, and that's all it takes to start your day off right. And I know what you're asking. You're asking the same thing I am. You're looking at this bottle of green and saying that has to taste terrible. And that's the surprising part. See, I'm used to trying dietary supplements and it just tastes like grass, but with AG1, it tastes just fine. There's not a really strong flavor whenever you drink it. Again, the primary thing inside of this is water. And what aftertaste it does have is just kind of sweet. Not in like a sugary way, but kind of in like a vanilla way, in like a natural sweet way. I tried it and thought it was vanilla. My mom tried it and said it was kind of like a cinnamon. But it's just a pleasant drink that you can have in the morning to start your day off right, without feeling like you just licked the front lawn. AG1 is effectively 9 different health products working together as one, and it's an entire comprehensive diet made simple. And if you're wanting to start your day off right, then now's the perfect time to do it. Because if you go to the link in the description and get in on AG1 now, then with your purchase, you will receive these 2 free gifts. One is 5 of the AG1 travel packs. This is the exact same thing that you get in the large tub that you scoop out of. These are just individually wrapped travel packs so that you can bring them on the go. And the other is a year's supply of vitamin D3 and K2. All you gotta do is take a drop of this stuff once a day to get your daily intake of those vitamins. Meaning again, it makes your diet much more easy to manage, and since it's only a drop a day, this is a year's supply. So again, if you get in on AG1, you will get 5 extra days of AG1 and a year's worth of vitamin D3 and K2 for free. Because since your health is so important, it shouldn't be complicated. And now, it doesn't have to be. Again, go to the link in the description to get in on AG1 today. Thank you all so much for watching the ad, and thank you to Athletic Greens for sponsoring this video. It really does mean the most. Hope you all check them out. Link is in the description, and we are back to the video. We are going to go ahead and get into it, but as always, thank you for watching. Once we have context for everything, we're going to go back and look at the events that led up to the robbery that day. But for now, I think there's no better place to start than with the events of August the 28th. Hey everyone, this is Mini Wendigoon. This is a really big case with a lot of moving parts, so there's some stuff I forgot to include on the initial recording. So whenever you see this little dude, it's me speaking through his corporeal form to give you information I forgot earlier. The first thing I want to mention is I will be using some diagrams and images from pizzabomber.com. It's a fantastic website of people who have done a great job at compiling stories and evidence photos from the case itself. So if you see any of the diagrams in this video that seem helpful, I encourage you to check them out. They'll be linked in the description. And thank you pizzabomber.com for the work you're doing. On August the 28th of 2003, a 46-year-old pizza delivery driver named Brian Wells was working his normal shift at the Mamma Mia's Pizzeria in Erie, Pennsylvania. Everything was going normal until around 1:30 p.m. The owner of the pizzeria received a delivery call. The owner couldn't understand what the guy on the other end of the line was saying, so he passed the phone to Brian. Brian says that the call was for 2 sausage pizzas to be delivered to 8631 Peachtree. Brian drives to the location that turns out to be an abandoned radio station. It also turns out that after future investigation, the original phone call was made from a nearby gas station. Brian goes to deliver the pizzas, and all seems normal for now, until nearly an hour had passed by and Brian hadn't come back to work. What might have happened to Brian in that hour of lost time will be discussed later, but what matters now is what happened at 2:30. At around 2:30 p.m., Brian walked into a local PNC bank. He was holding a cane and wearing a t-shirt that had "Guess" written across it. Underneath the t-shirt, something was lying on his chest. When Brian gets to the counter, he slides a note to the teller demanding $250,000. He also reveals that the cane that he's holding is a shotgun in disguise, and that underneath his shirt is a large bomb collar. Somehow, in that hour of time between delivering the pizza and showing up here at the bank, Brian had a bomb strapped to his chest with what seemed to be a giant metal handcuff wrapped around his neck to keep it in place. The note that he slid the teller was ridiculously long, and I'm not going to read all of it for sake of time, but as you can see here, this is way more information than is needed to just say, "Give me $250,000. The teller says that the vault cannot be open at this time, and the best she can do is give him all the money they have in the register. So Bryant walked out with $8,702. During this time, other tellers were trying to usher people out of the bank, and a few people began to call the police. From here, Bryant drove to a McDonald's parking lot, I'll explain why later, and then from there, about 15 minutes after the robbery took place, police pull him over in the parking lot of Eyeglass World, just as Bryant was trying to leave the McDonald's. Police get Bryant out of the car, arrest him, but as they're arresting him, he mentions something about a bomb. The officers look under his shirt, and sure enough, he has a bomb collar strapped to his neck. The police immediately clear the street and begin to evacuate the nearby buildings and roads so that no one gets hurt. The initial stop was made around 2:54 and the bomb squad was called at around 3:04. But there was a problem with the bomb squad getting there. See, in order to make sure that no one would be harmed if the bomb did go off, they began to evacuate and clear the main road that led to the Eyeglass World parking lot. What that meant is further down every street, there was a lot of congestion. So the bomb squad truck that would normally be able to get there just fine now had to contend with traffic. The police keep their guns aimed on Brian. They have no idea if this guy has strapped a bomb to himself in order to rob the bank, if someone else has done that to him, so they begin to ask him questions. All that Brian says is that 3 black men held him down and strapped the bomb to his neck. When asked to further identify these men, he couldn't and simply said that they were 3 black guys. In the midst of this, Brian seems to be making nonsensical requests, like he asks the police to call his boss so that his boss doesn't think he's slacking off work. He also begins to tell the police that maybe if they can take the notes and continue on to the next steps, that they can get the key to let him free. Again, the police have no idea what Brian's talking about, but Brian continues to say maybe they can follow the steps. By this time, local news crews had shown up and were recording the entire ordeal from several different angles. As the police and Brian are talking, the collar on Brian's neck begins to beep. When it does, Brian seems to sort of panic. His voice gets more exacerbated, and he keeps asking the police to come get it off of him and saying that he's not lying, it's gonna blow. As the beeping gets faster and faster, Brian begins to try to physically scoot away from the bomb that is strapped to his chest, seemingly trying to get away from the explosion. The tension continues to build until at 3:18, the bomb explodes. The back wall of the metal device that was hanging in front of Brian's chest had a metal plate that seemed to be cut in segregated pieces to cause fragmentation. The back plate didn't work quite like that, but what it did do is blow the piece of metal inward that punched about a fist-sized hole through Brian's chest. Brian died in seconds, and the entire ordeal was recorded by the news cameras. Now, due to a broadcasting malfunction, Brian's death wasn't shown live on the air, but the footage still existed and managed to find its way online. The bomb squad finally arrived 3 minutes after Brian's death. As they began to clear his car and search through the evidence, they found 9 pages of handwritten notes in Brian's vehicle. The notes contained a series of instructions for Brian, the receptionist at the bank manager, and the police. Brian being referred to as bomb hostage within the notes. The notes given to Brian featured a series of rules for him on the first page. The rules are as follows. Number 1, you must follow a course of instructions to find keys and combination codes to disarm bomb. Do not insert keys into keyholes until instructed. Some keyholes are booby-trapped to prevent tampering. Number 2, drive 60 miles an hour throughout course. Number 3, use only 2 or 3 minutes at each stop. A sentry will be watching at each stop to ensure you are not being followed. Number 4, bomb has tripwires. Forcing or tampering will detonate. Number 5, all weapons, papers, containers, tapes, etc. must be returned to us. Each item you find after dropping money has a key and/or combination word. You will need to decipher the combination. This will disarm some tripwires before you unlock. This procedure is to make sure you leave no materials behind. And upon reading the notes, it seems that Brian was sent on a life or death scavenger hunt. The notes he was given gave him very specific instructions of what to do following the bank robbery. After robbing the bank, Brian was to drive in and around Erie finding different combinations and keys to stop the bomb on his chest from blowing up. I really cannot stress how much this whole thing is like a saw trap. He seemingly was placed in a collar and given a series of directions with a timer of 55 minutes to complete everything, or else the bomb would detonate. So the first thing the police do is keep following the trail. It seemed that along each stop there would be another note to give Brian more directions on where to go next. It seems that after robbing the bank, the next step was go to the nearby McDonald's. At that McDonald's, next to the McDonald's sign, there was a rock, and underneath that rock was a jar containing Brian's next steps. Brian had made it that far. As mentioned earlier, police saw him as he was leaving the McDonald's, and it seems that when the police stopped him, he was going on to the next objective. That next objective was located in the woods just outside of town. It's also mentioned in the note that there were a series of sentries who would be driving around town making sure Brian was doing everything he was supposed to. And the first thing he was supposed to do after leaving McDonald's was tie an orange ribbon around a fire hydrant as a signal that the bank had been successfully robbed. It seems that the police stopped him right as he was about to tie the ribbon. So the police follow these notes to the location mentioned in the woods, and when they get there, sure enough, they find an orange ribbon and a jar that contains the next set of directions. While they were searching that location, Officer Lamont King says that he saw a blue van pull up in the tree line, see the police officers that were searching the area where the jar was located before the van stopped, backed up, and drove away. Keep that blue van in mind for later. The note they found in the woods told them to drive to a road sign a few miles away, get out at the road sign, and walk through the grass into a field. When the police got to that next location, they found the jar, but nothing was in it. Meaning that either whoever was watching this go down, perhaps the sentries and the person in the blue van as mentioned earlier, had seen the police were meddling with everything, so they went to the jar and took out the next set of directions before the police could get there, or Bryant was never intended to make it that far. So with that, the police couldn't keep chasing the trail of breadcrumbs and had to begin their investigation as per usual. As you can imagine, this was a huge deal in Erie at the time. This small town had been hit by what was seemingly this masterminded heist with a guy with a explosive collar strapped to his neck who was supposed to carry it all out. There was a lot of pressure to get this case solved, so the police began to work fast. Hey, so we're going to do the rest of this over here. Sitting in that chair and turning like that over and over made me feel like Santa Claus, so we're just going to stand. The first thing the police did was search Brian's home, and they didn't find much. The one thing they did find was the number of a local prostitute named Jessica Hoopsick. It seems that Brian knew Hoopsick and would regularly call her to turn tricks. I wonder if YouTube's demonetization's caught on to that one yet. We'll find out. But the only thing that proves is that he was okay with very brief steps outside of the law. That is still a far cry from a bomb collar bank robbery. So while the police are investigating this and trying to go through Brian's history to see if he had known anyone who would be capable of something like this, or if anyone in Brian's past would indicate that he'd ever do something like this, something weird happens. On August the 31st, only 3 days after the bank robbery and Brian's death, the only other pizza delivery driver at Mamma Mia's Pizzeria, a man by the name of Robert Panetti, who was the co-worker of Brian, dies. He died in his home of what appears to be a drug overdose. Now, Robert did have a history of drug abuse in the past, so it's not out of completely left field that he would die of an OD. But what was suspicious about this to investigators is originally they had went to the pizzeria to interview Robert on that Saturday. Brian died on Thursday the 28th, and Robert was approached to be interviewed 2 days later on Saturday the 30th. But Robert said, well, I'm working a shift today. I don't really want to do the interview. Can we put the interview off till Monday? And the investigator said yes, but the night before he's supposed to be interviewed on August 31st, he overdoses. So, as you could imagine, this wasn't open and shut for investigators, and the door was left open that he might have some connection to everything that's going on. And they figured that even if it was an overdose, maybe the stress of being interrogated by police, if he had something to do with the bank heist, was too much for him, so he just kept taking drugs and eventually died. In the meantime, police are looking for Jessica Hoopsick and can't seem to find her. The only other lead that they follow during this time is there was a woman who was a previous girlfriend, I believe, of Brian's, who was now dating a black guy who, the reports vary. Some say he was a welder, others say he was a mechanic, some kind of person who was good with toolcraft, who could theoretically make the collar bomb. And if you'll remember, the only thing Brian gave them to go off of before he died was that 3 black man threw the collar on him. So the cops in Erie, Pennsylvania are like, all right, I guess we'll just look for black people. But as you can imagine, that didn't go anywhere. The 2 other points they had to go off of was the radio tower and the bomb itself. At the radio tower, the forensics team took a pretty good record of what went down going off of the dirt road and path in front of the radio tower itself. So they could see from the dirt that Brian's car drove up. There were several people standing out front of the radio tower, and as indicated by the dirt, there was a sort of scuffle where it seems a couple people fell over before Brian's car drives away. Assumedly, it was at the radio tower that this bomb collar would have been put onto him. So the question is, what went down at 8631 Peach Street? It seems that there was some kind of a fight in the dirt, but other than that, they didn't have a lot to go on. The other lead was the bomb itself, which was weird to say the least. The inner machinations of the bomb itself weren't that complicated. It was just 2 pipe bombs laid in front of Brian's chest that were filled with smokeless powder. It's pretty much the most elementary bomb you could make. The actual locking mechanism around the neck was effectively a giant handcuff, with the same system of ratchets that click into place, and a key that's needed to release the ratchet so that it can come undone. Now, while that was the basic construction of the bomb, it had several other complications. Like, while one key could be used to undo the whole thing, the bomb itself had 4 keyholes and a 3-digit combination lock. On top of that, the inside of the case holding the bomb had 2 kitchen timers that were seemingly used for the countdown that would start the explosion sequence indicated by the beeping noise. But there were also a lot of really weird implements on the bomb as well. Like, for example, there was a fake cell phone that was put into it, seemingly just to throw people off, as well as several wires that didn't go anywhere. On top of that, there were several warnings written on the collar itself that said things like, if you cut the wrong wire, it will cause an early detonation. If you try to remove it this way, that will cause a detonation. And seemed to be a way of giving red herrings to whatever police officer would try to remove the device. It was an otherwise simple mechanism that was made overly complicated to throw off investigators. Kind of like this entire case. Another point to mention is that in order to keep the bomb collar intact during the investigation, the police decided to remove Brian's head during his autopsy. As you could imagine, this decision was highly contested by the family, but since the bomb collar was the only thing the police had to work with, they decided that keeping it intact was paramount. See, at this time, the FBI began building a profile and putting out to the public that whoever's doing this isn't just in it for the money. There's easier ways to steal $250,000. They're partially in it for the game of it all. Because think about it, supposedly just kidnapping a random guy, throwing this collar on him, and then doing things like the fake instructions or the ridiculously long series of notes to give to the bank teller and the entire scavenger hunt of the crime itself. It seems that whatever was going on here was more than just a bank robbery. However, it would get far more complicated than anyone expected very soon. On September the 20th, 3 weeks after Brian's death, the Erie police receive a phone call. The phone call is from a man named Bill Rothstein, who says he has a dead body in his freezer. Bill says that the body is of a man named James Roden. However, Bill says that he did not kill James Roden and that the killer was a woman named Marjorie Deal Armstrong. Marjorie is one of the most important players in this entire case, and for good reason. See, Marjorie had a history of legal trouble in Erie, Pennsylvania. In 1984, she was the focus of the most famous murder case in Erie's history, up until this murder case. In 1984, Marjorie murdered her boyfriend by shooting him in the chest 6 times while he was asleep on the couch. It was a whole legal trial because Marjorie said that she was being abused by this boyfriend and that the reason she killed him while he was asleep is because she felt it was the only time she'd be safe from him. And after a very messy and public trial, Marjorie was released. 8 years later, in 1992, Marjorie's at the time husband came to the hospital for a brain hemorrhage. He was unresponsive, but according to Marjorie, he had hit his head falling into the coffee table. Her husband died while at the hospital, and Marjorie sued the hospital for malpractice and won. However, given her past history of shooting the guy to death, as well as her current endeavors, several people think maybe her husband didn't die from just falling into the coffee table. There was also apparently a boyfriend somewhere in there who she dated for a while who took his own life, so she has a history of men dying in her presence. So back in this timeline, Bill calls the police and says that Marjorie murdered James Roden and the body is now stuffed in Bill's freezer. Bill says that Marjorie had murdered James over a money dispute and had Bill get rid of the gun. Bill, being afraid of Marjorie and knowing how manipulative she can be, decided to help her get rid of the evidence and store the body. However, It was after Marjorie asked him to grind up the body of James Roden that Bill couldn't do it and decided to call the police. So why does any of this relate to our Brian Wells case? What does any of this have to do with a bank heist on August the 28th? Well, the address that Bill lived at, where James Roden's body was located, was 8645 Peach Street, effectively the front yard of the abandoned radio tower. Whenever Bill calls the police, he tells them to arrest Marjorie, who is currently living at Bill's house. So the police go to get the body, they arrest Marjorie, and they go through both of their houses, and both of them were compulsive hoarders. Not only did they have clutter and just various things to such a degree that the police weren't able to find the floor as they were walking through the house, but Marjorie here also had 400 pounds of butter and 700 pounds of cheese, all of which were completely rotted. The officers who arrested Marjorie said that the most distinct memory of the entire event was A, how loud she was, and B, how stinky she was. The entire house was covered in dog poop and rotten food, and she smelled like both of those things. And before you're like, wow, Wendigoon, that's really mean to make fun of someone who's in poverty. For one, Marjorie was not in poverty, because if you'll remember, she won a ton of money from her dead husband's malpractice suit. The specific amount seems to be private, but she bought a ton of expensive things and continuously told people that she was rich. And two, Marjorie is really, really annoying. She would never stop talking, she would constantly yell and berate people around her, even people who were trying to help her, like reporters and her own attorney. A few doctors diagnosed her with things like bipolar disorder, but other doctors just said she had a narcissistic personality disorder. The FBI agents who would interrogate her over the coming months said that anytime they would go to talk to her, she would just yell expletives at them, tell them to kill themselves, that she hated them, and then one of them would compliment her, be like, your hair looks lovely today, and she'd just stop immediately. In that 1984 case, whenever she murdered her boyfriend, her own defense attorney said that she should have never went to trial, because if she goes to trial, she can get off for some level of mental incompetency or being battered or what have you, and said that she should instead be put into an institution where she can be locked away forever. She is dangerous and smart, and that if she is allowed to go free, this will happen again. Which, if your own attorney's saying that, that's pretty bad. So Bill Rothstein calls the police, says that there's a dead body in his freezer, that Marjorie did it. The police already know who Marjorie is, so they go to arrest her, and they get James's body out and begin sifting through the house. Right after Bill made that phone call, he apparently attempted to take his own life. A lot of sources say that he only wrote the note and then never made any physical attempts to do it. But in the Netflix documentary, there's a scene where the police are walking through his house and ask what the bag of blood with a razor blade in it is, and he says that that's his. And this point's never refuted, so I imagine the police tested it and it turns out that that was his blood. So it seems there was some kind of physical attempt made. Bill hurriedly wrote a note after he called the police, assuming that he would have finished the deed by the time the police got there. In the note, he says, "The body in the freezer in the garage is Jim Roden. I did not kill him nor participate in his death. My apologies to those who cared for or about me. I am sorry that I let them down. I am sorry to leave you this mess, Bill Rothstein." However, the most interesting part is what he wrote at the beginning of this note that says, "This has nothing to do with the Wells case." Okay, so picture this. You're an investigator. You get a call that there is a dead body at this location directly in the front yard of the radio tower, right where the big mystery location of the bomb collar bank robbery. And officially, there's no connection because James Roden, come to find out in the autopsy, was killed 3 weeks before the day Brian Wells was killed. So seemingly, it's an unrelated incident. I mean, obviously they're going to investigate it, but the hard evidence is that it's just coincidence the two were located so close to each other. And then the guy who assisted in moving the body of James Roden writes in his note, "This has nothing to do with Brian Wells." So at this point, the FBI has 3 bodies that seemingly have no relation to each other, except for the guy who said that one of them is definitely not related, so definitely don't look into it, and whenever he's asked about it, he says he has no idea what they're talking about. I can't profess to know exactly how the FBI was feeling at the time, but if I had to guess, it was probably something like... Because it seems like while they've been investigating for the past month, these wheels have been turning in the background that there's been no evidence of for them to stop before it's too late. But now it seems that their best leads are Bill Rothstein and Marjorie Diehl Armstrong. So right now, let's talk about Bill Rothstein. Bill Rothstein, like Marjorie, was also a very annoying person, but for a different reason. Bill was the kind of guy who always felt like he was the smartest person in the room. He would constantly use needlessly complicated words and always talk down to people who he felt weren't as educated as he was. In a lot of the interview segments I've seen with him, he would randomly switch into speaking French or Hebrew and then be like, "Oh, you don't speak French? Okay, well, I guess I'll speak English for the commoners." He was the kind of guy who always wanted to prove how smart he was. Bill also had a lot of technical know-how. He was fluent with several different kinds of machinery and metalwork, and according to those around him, he was a very gifted guy who never really followed through on anything. He was going to be a pilot for a while, but then he decided he wasn't interested. He was going to be a professor, then decided he wasn't interested, which eventually led to the situation of him living in a derelict biohazard of a home while telling people around him that he's smarter than them because he can speak Hebrew. The way that Bill knew Marjorie is that the two of them were lovers, at least for a time. Several years back, Bill and Marjorie dated, and according to some reports, were even engaged for a time. However, the two broke up on bitter terms, but according to everyone who knew these two, Bill could never get over Marjorie. So anytime she had trouble or wanted something from him, he was at her beck and call. It's also important to point out that both of them were smart. I know that I've mentioned they had physical smarts, like she was conniving and he was fluent in things like French and Hebrew, but they both seemed to be clever as well. Marjorie had a master's degree, and Bill had apparently taken all kinds of college classes and led a group called the Fractured Intellectuals, which was, I imagine, a group of people who thought they were too smart for everyone else. I mean, he called his group the Fractured Intellectuals, like, okay. And it seems that a lot of the troubles with the investigation came from investigators underestimating these two. So anyway, Bill is now in interrogation for the phone call he made that's got Marjorie arrested and led to the body of James Roden. Bill is completely open with everything. He explains that Marjorie had hated James Roden for a long time. They were a very on-again, off-again relationship where they would be very passionate and in love one minute and then wanting to kill each other the next. Bill said one night, in a fit of rage, after they had had an argument over money, Marjorie loaded a shotgun and shot James in the back. Bill came over to help her, and after she gave him $2,000, he took the body to put in his freezer and then used a torch to melt down the shotgun. And as mentioned earlier, he was content on keeping it into the future, but whenever she asked him to grind up the body, he said he wouldn't do it. And once again, it was determined that James Roden was killed 3 weeks before Brian Wells. So seemingly, the two deaths were unconnected, other than the fact that it just so happened the body was hidden very close to the radio station. During this time, the only other person that the police were able to loop in to their investigation was an old roommate of Bill Rothstein's named Floyd Stockton. Floyd Stockton had lived with Rothstein supposedly at the time of James Roden's death and was currently in hiding for having physical relations with a 14-year-old girl, so real stand-up kind of guy. Eventually, the police find Floyd, and he backs up everything that Bill says about the James Roden case, but says he has no information about Brian Wells. So I want you to think for a second. There is currently a woman who has a history of murder. Again, she got off on him, but she has at least definitely killed 2 people at this point, Roden and her first boyfriend, justified or not. And then she has a lover, or on-again, off-again lover, who lives in the front yard of the location where Brian Wells was kidnapped, and he has an affinity for building metal contraptions and making things needlessly elaborate and trying to prove how smart he is. And they're trying to figure out who in that radio station, at that abandoned radio station, would put together a scenario where a man gets a bomb strapped to his chest and is told to follow a scavenger hunt. And they've got these two literally in the front yard. And what does the FBI do? After talking to Stockton, they remove Rothstein from the Brian Wells investigation. He's still having his whole investigation with James Roden, but they said, no, this guy looks totally clear of Brian Wells, even though he lives in the front yard of where the whole Wells situation went down. And when he wrote a suicide note, the first thing he said is this has nothing to do with Brian Wells, so don't ask about it. I'm convinced that like police television shows, like, you know, serial dramas, like Law and Order, Criminal Minds, those have to be funded by the State Department. Like, we know the Department of Defense funds games like Call of Duty because it's like propaganda, right? And like Homeland Security or the FBI or someone's got to be funding those TV shows because those shows are always like a cop sees a strand of hair and they're like, this clearly relates back to the cold case I read about in 1972 during my day off. When in real life, every single case I read about, the cops are like, after 8 months, they eventually searched the skeleton pile only to find that it was full of skeletons. So, after the police cleared Rothstein, Marjorie finds out about it, and she's not happy one bit. Also, if during the whole time of me mentioning them being on-again, off-again lovers, let me just clarify that publicly, they absolutely despised each other. If they did have a relationship, it was one built on hate, because they were constantly saying things to try to get the other one locked up. So, while Rothstein gets cleared of suspicion on the Wells case, while Marjorie is being moved through prison and the press are all over her with cameras, she looks at them and yells, Bill Rothstein is responsible for Brian Wells' death. So that opens the door back up. Okay, well, the person that we think killed Wells is now saying Rothstein killed Wells. So even though Rothstein wasn't the Fed's primary guy at the moment, people began to ask him questions, and over again, Rothstein said no, he has nothing to do with the Brian Wells case. Also during this time, Bill had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and his condition was slowly getting worse. And eventually, in 2004, he ends up in a hospital. In July, during his last month of life, feds would continue to go to his bedside and say, look, you're almost dead. You're definitely not going to go to trial at this rate. You'll be dead before anything happens. Why don't you just tell us, did you have anything to do with Brian Wells? And one agent said that after he asked him that question, Bill, laying on the bed, not even looking at him, sarcastically drew a big no with his finger. And up until Bill Rothstein's death on July the 30th of 2004, he denied any association with the Brian Wells case. So Bill is now dead. I could draw X's there. Oh, I could do the thing that they do in... Yeah, look at that. Oh, I've always wanted to do that, like the old CIA pictures and stuff, bulletin boards, like the target's dead or whatever. I gotta put the X over the I. That's cool. I like that. Like I said, YouTube's just a glorified daycare. I guess I draw an X over their eyes too, since they're dead. Do I draw an X over their eye? Feels kind of rude. I'll draw a red X over their eye. That feels less harsh. Y'all probably can't even see that, but yeah, red X is just to symbolize their death. So shortly after Bill's death, probably realizing there wasn't a lot of ways for this to play out, they pretty much had her dead to rights, Marjorie confessed to the death of James Roden. Specifically, she confessed to third-degree murder, but mentally ill, which means she was sentenced to 7 to 20 years in a mental institution. Again, I'm going to mention that you should definitely watch the Netflix documentary, because it's around this time that the creator of the documentary began to go to Erie, Pennsylvania, and make contact with these people directly. As a matter of fact, he tried to speak to Bill Rothstein shortly before his death, but Rothstein denied him. I mention that because it's during this time that the documentary maker begins to talk to Marjorie Deal, who is just willing to talk to anyone about anything relating to herself. So as soon as Bill's out of the picture, she immediately begins saying to both the documentary crew and the police that Rothstein was responsible for Brian Wells' death. And then from there, during her sentencing, it seems Marjorie just couldn't help but talk all about the Wells case. See, initially she was quiet about it and didn't bring it up. She implicated a friend of hers, Ken Barnes, on an old cold case, and whenever she saw that the police weren't interested in that, she was like, well, actually, I know a lot about the Wells case, so the feds started to listen. It seems that Marjorie wanted transferred to a different facility because she would apparently call her attorney and the news up to twice an hour just to babble on and on about the case. So at some point, her lawyer said something like, "Oh, I don't want to, drive all the way to the facility you're at. I can't do that every day." So she is trying to give information to the feds so that she can be closer to her attorney, so her attorney would have to come see her more. So she starts talking about the Wells case and says all kinds of crazy stuff. For one, she mentions to investigators that Rothstein had her buy 2 kitchen timers to be used in the explosive. This was a big deal because the fact that there were 2 kitchen timers wasn't made public knowledge, so it would be something that only the people who were a part of the case would be privy to. She also mentioned that it was weird how Rothstein had a blue van that he hid after Wells' death that he only began to use again after he was cleared of Wells' death. And if you'll remember, a blue van is what Lamont King saw out in the tree line the day of the bank heist whenever they went to the woods to find a clue and he saw a van out in the distance, meaning it's quite possible that that was Bill Rothstein's van. Also, during this time, they found a letter from Marjorie that indicated she was furious at PNC Bank, the same one Brian Wells robbed, because she thought that they were letting her father dip into her savings account, which wasn't true. It was his money to begin with, but she was still mad at PNC. So as feds would gently pressure her about things like this, like, "Hey, weren't you mad at the bank that the robbery took place at?" she just keeps saying more stuff. She starts to talk about how Rothstein was coordinating it. She says that Stockton, Rothstein's old roommate, was in on it. Also, in the meantime, this case keeps making the rounds through news sources and television shows. I think it was on America's Most Wanted like 3 times. And as they would keep telling this story over and over again in the press, new information would come out. Like, for example, remember how at the beginning of the story I said that the phone call that ordered the 2 pizzas that kicked all of this off was made from a payphone at a local gas station? Well, that's where the call was traced back to, but initially there were no eyewitnesses of who made the call. That is, until a guy in Erie was watching America's Most Wanted and saw the picture of Bill Rothstein and Marjorie Deal and said that those were the 2 people he saw at the payphone the morning of August the 28th. Meaning that's an eyewitness saying that Rothstein and Deal kicked the heist off. On top of that, another witness who was driving down the highway through Erie the day of August the 28th says that he saw Marjorie in a car driving on the median in the opposite direction up the highway going like 70 miles an hour, and said that she had a very distinct and abnormal face that he immediately recognized whenever he saw it on television. So that is 2 people who place Marjorie as the one, along with Rothstein, who kicked off the entire event by telling Wells to come out to the radio tower, and someone who saw her speeding down the highway in the wrong direction at the time everything was going down. And what was funny is the feds would go to Marjorie with this, because, you can't convict someone for murder or bank robbery off of one eyewitness, right? So they would go to Marjorie and be like, "Marjorie, this information's not looking good." And Marjorie would be like, "Well, if you get me immunity, I'll tell you everything I know." And they'd be like, "Oh yeah, what do you know?" And she'd be like, "Well, I know that on the day of August 28th, and she would just give them information. Like she couldn't quit talking because she was so full of herself. So she would just talk all of her information out the window. Eventually, the feds asked if she would do a ride along with them to show them where she was at the day of August 28th, the day of the heist. So she gets in the back of the car and drives them to every location she was at that day, which was always immediately next to Brian Wells. It was next to the bank, next to the McDonald's, next to Eyeglass World. And I guess she was saying all that in case someone had spotted her at any of these locations. But her story was that she was just conveniently shopping like 100 feet from Brian throughout the day. And also didn't know anything about the event, despite the roads being shut down, despite a bomb going off in the middle of town. Said she didn't see or hear anything until she went home that night and saw it on the news. So she gets into the car with the feds, tells them all of that, and then when they get back to jail, she goes, "But I won't tell you anymore without immunity." Like, do you even understand what a negotiation is or immunity? Like, I hyped her up a little bit, saying like, "Oh, she's smart, she had a master's degree and all that." But She is not smart when it would sacrifice bragging. Also during this time, the feds were building a case against her, even though she was doing a pretty good job of that herself, but they were building a case against her with information that had been taken from the past several years. For example, whenever she was in prison awaiting the trial for James Roden, there were several other women in the prison who began to literally take notes on the things she would say. Among these was a woman named Kelly McKellar, who anytime Marjorie would say something relating to either Roden or the Wells case, would write it down. Among those, she said things like Stockton being involved as one of the conspirators, and quote, "It's not like we didn't measure his neck for the collar." I should also mention that the reason these notes took so long to come forward as evidence and be made known to investigators is because the police department took the notes and filed them away in a desk inside of an envelope labeled snitch notes, and seemingly just forgot about them until years later. So yeah, see my skeleton pile joke from earlier. So while the feds are building their case, there's another character in this story who they've been keeping an eye on, who I should mention now. That man is named Ken Barnes. Ken Barnes was a local drug dealer who knew Stockton, Rothstein, and Deal personally. As a matter of fact, Barnes and his girlfriend would often go out fishing with Deal and Roden. During the Roden investigation, Barnes was very complicit with the police and would tell them about how Deal and Roden would get into fights all the time, and he's not surprised that Deal would eventually kill him. Also, if you'll remember, whenever Marjorie was trying to get her sentence reduced or some kind of immunity, she was trying to out Ken Barnes for an old cold case, so no honor among thieves. In 2005, while Barnes was in jail for completely unrelated drug charges, he was talking to his brother-in-law and said something about him being involved with the Wells case. So Barnes' brother-in-law went to the police and said, "Hey, I think my brother-in-law has something to do with the bomb collar bank heist." So the police began to interrogate him, and Barnes starts to say vague things about Marjorie's involvement. After Marjorie gets wind of this, she changes her story and says it wasn't actually Rothstein who was the mastermind of this whole thing. It was Rothstein and Barnes who were the mastermind of this whole thing, and she's of course innocent. And this kind of goes back and forth for a while, with Barnes saying stuff about Marjorie's involvement and Marjorie saying stuff about Barnes' involvement, until eventually Barnes realizes that eventually Marjorie's going to take some kind of plea deal and he's going to be out of luck, so he decides to get ahead of the curve. So on December the 9th of 2005, Ken Barnes gives a full confession. Ken says that the entire purpose for this bank heist was Marjorie Deal wanted her dad dead. Marjorie's mother had died years before, and Marjorie's father was at one time a very wealthy man. As he got older, he began to give more and more of his money to people in the community and local churches. Marjorie didn't like this, thinking that her father was giving away her inheritance. Which, funny side note, the father was asked and said that his daughter was never in his inheritance because he knew that she was crazy and would probably try to kill him. But nevertheless, Marjorie thought that if she could kill her father, then she'll get his money faster. And, before he donates it. So, she asked Ken Barnes how much it would cost for him to kill her father. Now, Ken says that he would, of course, never have done this, but he was just seeing if she'd be dumb enough to give him some of the money up front. I don't believe him at all, because there's no way they went through the stages of planning a whole heist over a joke, because he definitely wouldn't murder her father. He was so going to kill her father. But Ken says he would be willing to murder her father for $250,000. So, the four of these people decide to plan a heist that they will be completely physically removed from. Ken says that the day before August the 28th, on August the 27th, there was a meeting to discuss the events of the heist that would be played out the next day. Ken says the people at that meeting were Floyd Stockton, Bill Rothstein, Marjorie Deal, Robert Panetti, and Brian Wells. According to Ken Barnes, Brian Wells was a part of the conspiracy that would end up killing him. This was an immediate shock to everyone. Other than maybe the idea that he got in with the wrong crowd, no one thought that Brian was a part of his own murder. On top of that, Barnes says whenever they originally came up with the idea of the heist, James Roden was supposed to be the driver. But Barnes hadn't seen him for a few weeks before all of this went down, which is why he wasn't at this meeting. So seemingly that connects the Rodin case to all of this, because it seems that Marjorie killed him, perhaps because he wasn't going to go along with it or was going to tell somebody. At the very least, it seems Rodin knew about the bank heist. And according to an eyewitness who apparently saw Brian Wells with this group of people on August the 27th, and the confession that Stockton would later give after given a plea deal, all three say that Brian Wells was a part of the conspiracy. Specifically, according to Barnes, he thought that he was going to go in with a fake explosive, and that fake explosive was just a means of innocence if the plan doesn't work out. Because theoretically, if the cops stop him and they open the bomb case and see that there was never an explosive, but that Brian thought his life was on the line, then they're not going to thank him as one of the perpetrators. So according to Barnes, Brian was a part of it up until the bomb was real. According to Barnes, this was the events of August the 28th. Barnes says that he was picked up by Marjorie that morning to get ready for the heist. Everyone set up at the radio tower, and then Marjorie and Bill went to order the pizza. Whenever Brian got there with the pizza, he was standing there in front of Ken, Floyd, Bill, and Marjorie. As they're standing there, Stockton brings out the bomb collar from inside of the radio tower. Wells, realizing that something was wrong, or perhaps realizing then that the bomb was real, tries to get away. As he does, Barnes and Stockton tackle him, and while they're scuffling on the ground, Rothstein fires a bullet into the air. This is corroborated by the signs of struggle that were seen on the dirt road that day, as well as locals who said they heard a gunshot before the heist took place. Stockton and Barnes latch the bomb collar onto Brian's chest, and then Marjorie puts the t-shirt over him that says, "Guess." While she's doing that, she tells Brian that if the police ask who did it, just to tell them that it was 3 black guys. This explains why Brian, before his death, said that it was 3 black men he couldn't identify. Over the course of the robbery, Marjorie and Ken drove around to the locations that Marjorie had told the feds that she was at during the robbery, and the two of them watched with binoculars as Brian went through the steps of the heist itself. Whenever everything went wrong and the bomb exploded, Marjorie decided to get out of there, which resulted in her taking the wrong turn into the wrong direction of the highway and driving down the shoulder as the witness saw. On March the 27th of 2007, Stockton also made a confession in exchange for immunity, and his story corroborated Barnes. Now, at the time, it was not customary to record confessions. The thought process being that if someone is confessing in front of a camera, they're going to speak differently. So at the time, the FBI would just record notes and keep them internally. But according to the FBI, the two reports matched each other. Again, check out the Netflix documentary, because in the Netflix documentary, he calls Barnes directly, and Barnes gives him a recounting of that confession. Again, this entire video is basically just an advertisement for Netflix, so you're welcome. Here's a free one, I guess. Now, neither Stockton nor Barnes knew exactly who came up with this whole thing. They both kind of presented the idea that they were more so hired into the scheme. Although, since all this went down, the police have all but confirmed that the person who at least built the collar was Rothstein. After sifting through all of the junk in Rothstein's house, they found diagrams that were a one-to-one match for the explosive collar itself, as well as writing that matched between the two, and even what appears to be a small glimpse of Rothstein's handwriting on the back of one of the notes. So, at least the physical aspects, it seems Rothstein was the mastermind of. However, even if he did the physical building, which, again, we figured considering that he worked with metal and was a sort of craftsman, that's not to say Marjorie wasn't still the mastermind. Marjorie continues to say that she had nothing to do with it, but knows everyone else is involved, but at this point, it's their word against hers. So, Marjorie finally goes to trial for the conspiracy of bank robbery and use of a destructive device and blah blah blah, and she is eventually convicted on all 3 counts. During the trial, she was very annoying and loud and constantly yelled things like liar, and then the judge had to keep shushing her. And by the end of it, she was sentenced to life plus 30 years. Specifically, the charges that she was convicted of was armed bank robbery, conspiracy to commit armed bank robbery, and using a destructive device in a crime of violence. So, she gets sentenced to life and then some, Barnes got his sentence reduced from 45 years for being responsible for the conspiracy down to 22 as part of his plea deal to testify against Marjorie, and Stockton just walked as a free man because he had already served his time for the 14-year-old girl thing that I mentioned earlier, and he somehow managed to get immunity for talking about all this. Also, during the trial, Marjorie was diagnosed with breast cancer and was given 7 to 10 years to live. Up to the end, Marjorie continued to say over and over again that she was not responsible for the conspiracy, that they got the wrong person, that the FBI's idiots for letting everyone else get away, and that Brian Wells was a part of the conspiracy. She maintained this up until her death on April the 4th of 2017. While he was scheduled to be released in 2027, Ken Barnes died on June the 20th of 2019 due to complications related to being diabetic. Floyd was never in court to testify against Marjorie because during the time of the trial, he was actually undergoing heart surgery. Again, he was free to go after the trial anyway because of the immunity deal he cut. And Stockton died last year on August the 10th of 2022 due to an acute respiratory failure. So now, every single person on this board is dead. And it seems that whatever this story was, whatever everyone's true account in the conspiracy might have been, it's dead with them. But there's one person up here who's still alive and still has a story to tell. And that's Jessica Hoopsick. See, the only way I've mentioned her in any of this so far is that she was a phone number written down in Brian's house after his death. During this entire series of events, for 15 years, the FBI, the local police, family members were all trying to get a hold of Jessica, but she always seemed to be just out of reach. Police would approach her, ask if she knew anything about the Wells case. She'd say that she didn't, and they didn't have, anything to arrest her with, so they just have to let her walk. News crews, the guy who made the Netflix documentary, the feds, all tried to get in contact with her, and she was always just out of reach. She came around whenever they did the initial trial and hearing regarding the case of Brian Wells itself because she was summoned, but after she gave a short testimony of not really knowing anything, she just walked out and never followed up with anyone. As a matter of fact, again, I know I keep mentioning the Evil Genius documentary, but in that documentary, the creator of it goes up to her and asks to do an interview, and she agrees to meet him later that day, and then never shows up. See, the reason the police wanted her so bad, otherwise she would just be a number that Brian had. And again, he had a couple of prostitutes' numbers as well. There seemingly shouldn't be a reason that they're after Jessica so much if that was just one contact that Brian knew. But the reason that the police wanted her so bad is because she was mentioned by Ken Barnes. See, as mentioned earlier, Ken was a drug dealer, and specifically, he sold crack to a lot of the people around Erie. One of those people was Jessica Hoopsick. So, we finally have a tangible connection of all of this web of people that goes back to Brian. See, in spite of seemingly all this being cleared up, we had accounts from two different guys who were involved, and it seems pretty definitive that Marjorie and Bill were the main masterminds, or at least ones who did the physical labor of the heist. A lot of the little details don't make a lot of sense. Like, for example, he says that the day of August the 28th, remember they called Brian, he comes out to the radio tower to deliver the pizzas to get set up for this heist, and then a fight breaks out when he realizes the bomb is real, right? Well, in his story, he says that Brian drives up to the radio tower, gets out of the car, and then waits for them to hand him the money for the pizzas. Which, what? Supposedly, according to Barnes, Brian is walking up to have, he's about to start a bank heist, and the phone call was just a ruse to get him out of work. So he's now standing there in front of him, and it also looks good like they kidnapped the random pizza driver, right? So he walks up to them, and he's like, okay, give me the money for the pizzas so I can take it back to my boss, and then I'll come back and we'll rob a bank for $250,000. And the documentary maker confronts Barnes about this, and he's like, wait, you, why would he be waiting for the money? You all are about to rob a bank. And Barnes says, oh, well, actually, Wells didn't know that we were about to rob the bank. And the documentary maker's like, what are you talking about? You said he was at the meeting the day before. And Barnes is like, oh, well, Yeah, he was at the meeting. He just, he didn't know we were doing it then. So according to Barnes, Brian was there the day before at the pre-planned meeting, and then the next day when he shows up to the abandoned radio tower to go through with it, he doesn't know they're doing the robbery. Also, Barnes mentioned that Robert Panetti was at the meeting the day before as well. Yeah, remember that guy? And apparently, again, not public, but apparently Stockton corroborated this as well. But then he just disappears from the record. They don't say that he's at the radio tower. They don't say he's a part of a conspiracy. They just say he was at the pre-plan, supposedly to make sure that, I don't know, Brian is able to take that call, I guess, to drive out to the radio tower. And then he overdoses a few days later. What I think was happening is that they were, and again, I'm just a YouTuber. I am effectively a stupid child who is just saying his opinion as someone who reads cases like this a lot, so take it with a grain of salt. But in my opinion, it sounds like these guys were crafting the narrative that the FBI wanted to hear. They had their boards, they were asking questions about Panetti. They had suspicions that Wells was somehow involved because he knew the prostitute that bought crack off of Ken Barnes. So the FBI keeps pushing. It's like, oh, was Panetti involved? What about Wells? Was that guy involved? So they're just like, yeah, Panetti was there, and Wells too. But Panetti didn't show up again. We didn't see him till, we heard about him after he died. And Wells, he was there too, but he didn't know we were doing the robbery the day after we had the meeting for the robbery. So it seems like they're just crafting a narrative that fits what the FBI thinks is the story of what happened, because then they're able to get stuff like half of their sentence and full immunity in order to deliver these stories. I also think it's super suspicious that the guy who, again, had relations with a 14-year-old girl, such a heinous crime that if he did anything after that, he would be put under the jail, got full immunity in a murder bank robbery heist to give specifically information that was never made public, but corroborated with what Barnes says. That just feels a little bit weird. So there's some inconsistencies in their confession, and yeah, they're right about the parts about Rothstein and Marjorie, sure. But when it comes to stuff like Brian and Panetti, like, what are they talking about? Well, again, whenever the creators of Evil Genius were doing the documentary, Hoopsick went to prison on, again, an unrelated drug charge at the same time that Marjorie was still alive and in prison as well. While in there was apparently a fight between Marjorie and Jessica, where Marjorie said some heinous things to Jessica and apparently backed her up against the wall, maybe hit her a few times. So after Jessica gets out of jail, she called the documentary makers who she had previously stood up and said she's ready to tell her side of the story. So after about 15 years of silence, Jessica gives her side of the story. She says that one day she was buying crack from Ken Barnes when Ken Barnes mentioned to her that he's planning a bank robbery. Again, back on my suspicions that Barnes and Stockton were more involved than they made themselves out to be. They just wanted themselves to sound good to the FBI. She says that Barnes was planning a bank robbery and asked Jessica if she knew somebody who would be a good gopher for the robbery they were about to commit. Effectively, they needed someone who would follow orders and they could scare into getting what they want. A couple things to note here. At this point, according to Jessica, her and Brian were not just on a business relationship, but they had seen each other enough times that they had a weird sort of friendship dynamic. They would go out to eat on occasion. Brian would drive her to her doctor's appointments. The other detail, and I do not mean this to be mean. This is going to sound mean. I know people are going to be like, oh, you shouldn't say that. But it is important to this case. And I think it's what a lot of people are implying, but no one will say specifically. So I'm going to be the one to get in trouble. Who cares? Brian Wells, from everything I've read from all the accounts around him, seems like a dumb guy. And I mean that in the nicest way. Everyone who spoke to him said he was such a kind, loving soul who was a joy to be around, but some of the nuances I hear imply that, I'm not saying that he was mentally deficient, I think he was all there, but that he just simply wasn't the brightest. He dropped or failed out of high school, depending on which entry you read. He went to be a mechanic and then quit that and became a pizza delivery driver, and he had done that for the past 10 years and only showed up late to work on one day and it was the day his cat died. He was a hard, diligent worker, and it seemed to be kind to those around him. His landlord said that anytime he would get happy, he would do a dance. Anytime he had an emotion, he was just bursting at the seams with it. And once again, I'm not saying that to say he was mentally deficient or there was anything wrong with him in any sense. I'm just saying he seems like the kind of guy who you could easily scare and get to do what you want. And it seems that Jessica thought that way too, because Ken Barnes said, if you can find someone for this heist, I'll give you crack for it. And she said that a client she regularly sees, Brian Wells, would be the right guy for the job. Jessica said that Bryant was a pushover. And after giving his information to Barnes, Barnes had Jessica get Brian's work schedule so that they would know the times he's delivering pizzas and they'll plan the heist for a day that he'll be delivering. So despite years, over a decade, of the family and prosecutors believing that Brian and Robert were a part of this scheme, if Jessica's to be believed, it seems like both of them were innocent. And again, this isn't a perfect outcome to everything, right? Why would Jessica, who, mind you, is the person who gave Brian over to Barnes and this whole heist, according to her, she had no idea that they were going to kill the guy. She just thought it was part of a robbery, which I'm willing to believe. But she's still admitting to dragging an innocent man into this whole web of crime. And as the feds have pointed out, why be silent for 15 years and just come out with a story now, when she's in, theoretically, just as much danger if this is considered a murder? She's in just as much danger as getting charged with something now as she would have back then. And keep in mind, at this point, the FBI had closed the file. They said all these people were involved and that Brian Wells was a co-conspirator. And at the hearing for it, the family shouted and screamed that that was a lie, that Brian would have nothing to do with this, and Jessica stayed silent through all of that. So it's understandable to not believe her now when she comes forward after getting into a fight with Marjorie and saying that Brian was innocent. But at the same time, I don't know what she herself would have to gain from saying that now, because she was effectively cleared of any relation to it, or at least they couldn't get her on anything. And at the time she was in jail with Marjorie, it was just for an unrelated drug charge. So now she's out in the world, she can just walk away from it, but decides to go to the film crew and let them know that Brian was innocent. The documentary also brought up another interesting point. Perhaps the reason that Stockton, Barnes, and Marjorie, even though Marjorie never admitted to being a part of the scheme, she said she thinks Brian's involved, which, okay. But perhaps one of the reasons they all perpetuated the idea that Brian was involved is because, again, as the documentary points out, if Brian is a part of the scheme and dies when the bomb goes off, then that is almost kind of self-inflicted. It's like they were all conspiring for this crime and effectively an accident happened and he died. But if he's an innocent pizza delivery driver who they kidnapped, then it's murder. Then there's no statute of limitations on it. Then no one's getting a plea deal. So it was in their best interest to implicate Brian. And again, I'm pretty sure Robert was just because the feds kept asking about him. So they said, yeah, sure, he was at the meeting. But from everything I've seen, every source I've read, Robert had nothing to do with it. He was just a guy who had a drug problem, and during the stress of this whole thing, overdosed. So while, again, there's no definitive answer, it's pretty much who you want to believe out of this den of thieves, I personally don't think Brian was involved. While I was reading through all these case files and these court reports and what have you, before I ever got to Jessica's part, it was really cool researching this because it's like, I was experiencing the revelations as they were happening. But before I ever got to Jessica, the whole Brian thing didn't sit right with me. I know the FBI announced that they've officially concluded that he's involved, but they also officially concluded that Waco was justified. So, I got problems with those little press conferences they do. But whenever I was reading all of this, and they just kept saying Brian was involved, Brian was a part of the conspiracy, and he was up until because he thought it was going to be a fake bomb, but then oh no, the bomb's real, and then he got scared. But then other people were saying he thought the bomb was fake the whole time until it started beeping on the street. And there was no consistency, especially with stuff like Barnes saying he was waiting to take the money for the pizza. It just felt like it was an easier case if Brian is part of the problem, if he's part of it, because he did stuff like lie to the police, about there being 3 black guys who threw it on him. He was knowingly embedded with a prostitute who knew Ken Barnes. Like, it just seemed easier if Wells was a part of it. No one goes to jail for murder. And I'm not directly saying this to imply that, you know, the feds made stuff up or whatever. I'm not saying that. But it just feels like after a series of cases that went on for over a decade, that they just like, okay, this is an answer, this closes it up. Well, by the time the FBI made their announcement, it had been 3 or 4 years, I think. But the trials continued over years and years. I don't know, it never set right with me. And then to hear Jessica say that she was the one who gave Brian's information to Barnes that kicked this whole thing off, that it's hard to explain. It's just like you look at all the pieces laid out, you look at the puzzle as it's built, you look at 15 different interpretations from different articles and journalists of what it all means, and Brian being set up is, to me, the only way all the pieces fit together. So again, just a dumb kid on the internet, but I do think that Brian Wells was innocent, and I think it is horrifically tragic that a guy can go in to just start delivering pizzas one day, and within an hour, his life is over. I also want to clarify that Brian's involvement may not be as clear-cut as I've kind of been making it out to be. As I said earlier, he was a guy that could be manipulated, so maybe they approached him and threatened him or his family if he didn't comply with the plans they had moving forward. I mean, that would certainly explain things like Marjorie saying they measured his neck for the collar. Some reports say that Brian owed money to Ken, so maybe Ken threatened Brian and said if he didn't go through with this heist, something bad would happen. Another element of the story I forgot to mention in my initial recording is that shortly after Brian's death, Jessica had a child who she believes is the son of Brian. Perhaps she told Brian about this. Perhaps Brian thought something bad would happen to Jessica or his soon-to-be-born child. We don't know exactly what happened, but regardless if Brian was a part of this plan from the beginning or the day it happened, I still feel like Brian was a victim. So, it seems like at the end of this, Marjorie was the mastermind of it all. She got Rothstein to do the manual work, and then all these 2 guys, Stockton and Barnes, were co-conspirators who did whatever level of legwork, and the victim was Brian Wells, coincidentally, because of the stress of it, Robert Pinetti, and Jessica seemed to be the link between Barnes and Wells. And I got to that point and I was like, yeah, I'm satisfied with this, it makes sense. But there was one question that kept bothering me through it all. So if this whole crew staged this robbery, which was not only, the biggest crime to ever hit Erie, Pennsylvania, one of the most insane and biggest crimes to hit the United States. Like, in 2003, this was the case everyone was talking about. So there's this massive case that has all these moving parts, angles, and questions. And why, if that's the case, then why would Bill Rothstein call the police over James Roden's body that was lying in his freezer? Because, again, his story is that, Marjorie killed Roden, and then I couldn't say no to her, so I stuffed the body in the freezer. Which is all well and good, but now we know that they had just committed a huge heist together, right? So why 3 weeks after that heist would you call the police on a body that you helped hide a month and a half ago with your co-conspirator? And here's my conspiracy theory. Here's how I think it played out. I really got the idea from this when I was reading the notes from Jim Fisher. He was an FBI agent who worked this case. Wired did an article where they recorded a lot of his thoughts. That Wired article is pretty good. I'll drop it in the description. But it was Fisher's idea regarding the case that made me look at this differently. So, off of his word, and again, I'm not smart, I'm just reading what smart people wrote down, my idea is effectively this. Marjorie, as it seems, orchestrated the whole thing. Her father agrees that she hated him, she wanted to kill him to take the money that he was giving away to people, and was seemingly going to do that through Ken Barnes. And I also don't believe anything that Barnes said, that he was not going to kill her father, because you don't plan a heist for over a month over a murder you're not going to do. So Marjorie and Barnes begin to plan the heist. They drag in Rothstein and Stockton because Rothstein was old lovers with Marjorie and would do whatever she said. He was also good with mechanics and building things. And Stockton was there and also a criminal. And if you're sheltering a fugitive from the law, then I guess, you know, Pirates Code, they have to help you with future crimes. So the four of them plan out this heist, and it seems to me like Rothstein came up with a lot of the inner workings of it. See, Marjorie just wanted $250,000. Her goal was not to do a heist, it was to kill her dad. So, which out of these four people would have a proclivity for wanting to make an overly complicated series of notes to give to both the bomb hostage, the bank teller, and the police, would set up a giant scavenger hunt that Wells would have to drive through, which, by the way, the FBI recreated that drive multiple times during the trial and determined that there was no way to survive it. Even if Brian floored it the whole way and got from one location to the other without missing a beat, there was not enough time. By the time he got that road sign, he was just going to drive wherever it told him and then blow up. So who would set up such a cruel series of hoops to jump through only to eventually get killed with a bomb and a giant metal device that is, once again, needlessly complicated? You can just tape a bomb to a guy's chest. You don't need the giant handcuff thing. Which out of these people would do all of that to look smart? Probably the guy who does everything to look smart. The self-titled fractured intellectual. So Marjorie wants the money. Rothstein takes over all of the inner workings of it, you know, decides like, okay, it's going to be a series of notes. We're going to kidnap a guy, makes a heist that is more complicated than it needs to be. So the heist is carried out. Again, my belief is Barnes talks to Hoopsick. Hoopsick drags Brian into it by giving them his work schedule, making him be the pizza man that comes out. While they are putting the bomb on him, Marjorie says to say it was 3 black guys. And I believe that Brian, genuinely thinking if he does what the perpetrators said, that he'll be allowed to live or they'll let him go. I think the reason he said it was 3 black guys is because he was so afraid that if he disobeyed, he'd be killed, that he just said what they told him to say. Again, like Jessica said, he was a bit of a pushover. So after Brian dies, the police are looking everywhere. They have nowhere to start, to the degree that they are just looking for black men who are tangentially related to Brian Wells. So it seems like these 4, at least for now, are in the clear, and then Rothstein calls the police over Marjorie's dead boyfriend. I think what happened is Rothstein was a bit smarter than perhaps I initially, while reading this stuff, or a lot of the investigators gave him credit for. I think Rothstein knew that Marjorie had a big mouth, and 3 people can keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. So he decides he is going to get out in front of this. And if anything happens, he is going to be the one who's buddy-buddy with the police, and more importantly, in front of whatever Marjorie says about him. So he calls the police over a murder that Marjorie had committed, and then in such remorse over it, plans a suicide. If you'll remember, he wrote out that suicide note. And then we're getting real harebrained conspiracy here, but stick with me. I think that Rothstein was smart enough to know that if you put at the top of the note, this has nothing to do with Brian Wells, the first thing the police are going to do is look into Brian Wells. And there's also that bag of blood that was at his house from his supposed attempt. Now, once again, between us, if you have a blade and are determined to do that, it's not that hard, frankly. So the idea that he only did it a little bit and then left the evidence, the blood and the razor, in a bag for the police to find, to be like, oh yeah, I attempted, and there's the evidence of it, that seems really suspicious. I think Rothstein, after this heist went through, which again, I think Marjorie gave the inception of the idea and Rothstein ran with it, I think that Rothstein staged everything afterwards that would eventually lead to exactly what happened. The FBI looked at how complicit he was with the James Roden investigation, and he had turned so much attention to Marjorie regarding Brian Wells that Marjorie was yelling on the news that Rothstein, Bill, he's the one who killed Brian Wells. Everything went according to plan, that the FBI told them to walk told him to get out of here. So this guy both assisted with the hiding of the body of James Roden and everything involving Brian Wells and walked out scot-free. I think a lot of the things that were seen as a sign of distraught, like the note or some of the comments that he made about Marjorie being manipulative and evil, I think that it was Rothstein once again being a bit smarter than perhaps I gave him credit for. And the most frustrating part about it is he was the first one to die. Like, as soon as that was over, he gets released, and then a year later, he's dead in a hospital bed. And still there on his hospital bed saying, no, not involved. When we know he was involved to some degree, right? Like, he has to be from the records that were seen in his house. He at least built the bomb collar. So he was involved, but the idea that he was the mastermind who just got to pass it off and die free makes me want to break something. Jim Fisher said it best when he said, Rothstein had to be the mastermind, and the most frustrating thing is he died with all the secrets. So yeah, that is my take on the crime, that Marjorie began the idea, Rothstein took it and ran, and all of this resulted in a scenario where Brian Wells was the victim. And in the end, once it was all over, Rothstein pulled the rug on everyone and was the only one of this entire crew who died without a conviction. I mean, Floyd wasn't convicted for this case specifically, but he was convicted for cases before. So yeah, that was a really needlessly long explanation about the bomb collar bank heist. I really hope this was interesting at all. I absolutely think this case is wild, like reading and learning about it. I tried to emulate that. I hope it came off some. The idea of like, oh, well, the guy who had the bomb around his neck, he's guilty, but then it turns out is not guilty, or maybe kind of, depending on who you believe. And Marjorie was the mastermind, only maybe not. Maybe Rothstein was, but he's dead, so we don't know. So back to Marjorie. It's a really wild and turbulent case to read about. I understand why I give the feds a lot of harshness for some stuff, and most of it's in jest, because I do understand why this would be incredibly frustrating to investigate. But I think it's very interesting. So hopefully you think it's interesting too. Again, I know I mentioned it 100 times, but it's because it wasn't only a documentary, it was in the field work. It was in the field work. Check out Evil Genius on Netflix. It's fantastic. There's also a ton of other, YouTube videos. Famously, BuzzFeed Unsolved, Shane and Ryan, my boys, not that I know them, I just like their channel. Shane and Ryan made a video about this on Unsolved, but when they made the video, it was before Jessica Hoop 6 confession, so that's another layer added to it. But yeah, check out that video too. I'll link stuff like that in the description. I'll throw some links in there. A couple notes to end on. For one, thank you very much to Dwayne from church for giving me the shirt that I wore in this video. It is very comfortable, and I hope I did you proud by wearing it in the video about a crazy murder heist thing. And also, this is a very large case with a lot of moving parts, and I'm sure that even after a couple revisions, I got something wrong. So if I can think of anything that I said out of order, or anything about the timeline or events that I got wrong, look in the description after this video's up. Underneath the ad, I'll put a little addendum section for any corrections I can think of. So yeah, if you think I got something wrong or want to make sure all the info's right, just check the description. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this. I think it's such an interesting case. Again, one of the most wild things ever. And I've talked about before, but true crime is kind of flooded with like serial killers and I guess some cults from time to time. But like some of the stories around bank robberies and like drug lords are by far the most interesting in my opinion. Like I'm not gonna, if someone wants to steal this idea, they can. But how about some train robberies, huh? Train robberies are cool. No one talks about those. I'm going to talk about one of those soon. But yeah, I love stories like this. I think they're interesting. I think they're neat, and hopefully you think they're neat too. And yeah, I've spoken my piece about it. So hopefully you enjoyed. Thank you for watching. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. More videos coming out this month. Stay tuned for hopefully some cool announcements with some projects and collaborations I'm working on in the future. That should be neat. Again, check out my YouTube community post and Twitter for signs of that. Wendigoon8 on Twitter for new announcements and whatnot. But I believe that should do it now. Now that we're done talking about this mess, I need to edit and get pictures and try to make this comprehensible, so wish me luck. But for now, I just want to say thank you for watching. I hope that you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!